Hi everyone, my name is Michael Kenney, and I teach middle school language arts and religion in St. Paul.
My name is Nitschke, and I teach high school physics in Tampa, Florida.
My name is Caitlin Riley, and I teach middle school social studies in Corpus Christi, Texas.
And I'm Sophia Denney, and I teach middle school English in Dallas, Texas.
So thank you for tuning into our presentation. Our presentation is called No Dad Jokes: How Non-Resident Fathers Seriously Impact Parent Involvement, Student Performance, and Pedagogy. So the origin of our research kind of began with similar anecdotes of the impact of non-resident fathers and kind of the impact it had in the classroom environment. That's kind of what got us all interested in this. To speak personally to my experience, upon initially going into the school I am at, I was struck by the attitudes of two different students. One student was really clearly making an effort to connect with me and just really took a liking to me right away without me even really introducing myself. And conversely, another student had just a polar opposite perception, kind of was just did not take a liking to me and made it known very immediately without getting a chance to even speak to me. And so this really struck me. And as I came to learn, both of them had non-resident fathers. And so I hypothesized at the time that that must perhaps be a reaction to me as a male figure in the classroom, as an authority figure. And so that's kind of what got me interested in it. And all of us had similar experiences of the impact of non-residential fathers in the classroom. So come to find out, the US has the world's highest rate of children living in single-parent homes. And disproportionately, these single-parent homes are run by mothers. Additionally, nearly a quarter of American children under 18 live in single-parent homes, and disproportionately, these single-parent homes are of minority students. And realizing that ACE often serves in minority communities, we hope that this presentation will equip ACE fellows to really navigate these evolving family circumstances well in just a few weeks. So today we're going to explore three main topics. First, we're going to walk through some theoretical frameworks or models. Secondly, we're going to talk about home life and parent involvement. And then lastly, we'll talk about what you can do from a pedagogical and collaborative standpoint.
So let's begin by asking, why should we care about parent involvement, and especially about families that have non-resident fathers? Well, if you look at this diagram, this is Bronfenbrenner's ecological model of development. And basically, Bronfenbrenner proposes that an individual's characteristics are not the only thing that impacts that person. They're also impacted by all of the settings that they find themselves in. So that includes kids at home and then also kids at school. And finally, and moving out from there, there are other systems as well, which include things like home and school's impact on one another. And that's something that we really want to focus on today, is the interaction between teachers and families, and how that eventually has impacts on the students themselves.
So we're gonna kind of dive into this by just looking at the landscape. So what does the modern family look like today? So actually in 1960, 87% of kids lived with two parents at home. And now as of 2014, only 69% of kids live with two parents at home. So home life and parent involvement. So I had noticed whenever I would email parents home, there would either be two parents listed, or if there's only one parent, it was almost always the mother. So 83% of kids who live with a single parent are living with their mother. And the mother can have substantial impacts. So her education, income, and how religious she is can produce higher academic achievement. Unfortunately, kids are more likely to experience trouble in school if they live with only their mother, and especially if they're living with their mother's boyfriend. And then, of course, single mothers do have to work and tend to make less money than two-parent families, so they are more likely to experience financial stress, which can also impact the child. So if there's a single mother, then we have non-resident fathers, so the dad who does not live at home. More and more kids are living without a father at home, but non-resident fathers can still make a difference despite not being in the house with the child. So we have results from a meta-analysis that looked at father involvement in student academic achievement. So a meta-analysis kind of looked at all the studies that are out there regarding academic achievement in non-resident fathers, and it found 66 studies, and of those 66, it kind of came to this one conclusion, or many conclusions, but this one most specifically, that there are statistically significant results that father involvement produced greater academic outcomes, and that holds true for both white and minority children, and actually even more so for minority families, just because they have an even higher standard for father involvement than white families. So we also have just like completely absent fathers. They don't live at home and have very little contact with their child, and this produces very negative outcomes. Students tend to perform worse in math specifically from this study, and have more of an external locus of control. And they typically have lower cumulative GPAs than those with a resident biological father. So now that we just kind of looked at that landscape, we're going to talk about pedagogy and collaboration.
Okay, so Molly just explained how impactful having an involved versus a non-involved father can be. Obviously, we are not at home and we cannot be a father for our students. However, we are at school, and when they're at school, we can try our best to help mitigate these negative results. One way that we can do that is by referring students to see our school counselor or school psychologist, if you have one. Obviously, ACE schools do not always have these resources, but if you do, counselors have been noted to be really helpful for students, especially those who live in high poverty areas, which, as we mentioned before, single mothers tend to make less money. So likely that would be a lot of your kids that have those absent fathers. But of course, this cannot be the solution each time. They might not want to talk to a counselor, you might not have a counselor. So we're going to go through some more potentials of how to mitigate these negative effects, both in the classroom and moving a little bit beyond the classroom.
So we're going to explore, Caitlin's going to return in just a minute and talk to you a little bit more deeply about the role that a male teacher can play in the classroom. But just to provide some initial thoughts, it's really important that we encourage male teachers to become teachers, not necessarily because they are the quote unquote fix for absent fathers of students, but for one really important reason. I love this first quote that says, "Deep gender divisions in the teaching profession go against democratic and egalitarian values schools are expected to promote." And so in other words, inviting diversity enables better collaboration and more creative solutions to be had. Additionally, having more males in teaching positions sort of helps our culture change this narrative that men are quote unquote meant to be in administrative or managerial positions and women are not. And so by kind of having men in education spaces, it helps students recognize that men can do, men and women can have interchangeable workforce positions.
All right. So, as Michael said, it's so important to make sure that we have a balance of male and female teachers in schools. But many researchers started to suggest that male teachers could be the solution for non-resident fatherhood problems in our country today. However, studies have found that male teachers don't necessarily improve classroom environments or motivation more than their female counterparts. The graph right here can show you that this was kind of a baseline for motivation, and students started out, they're not started out, but had female teachers, and they were right at below the line. And you can see that even with male teachers, it did not really change, right? They didn't move above this baseline. It was still negative. Secondly, academic achievement didn't increase for students who had male teachers. Even specifically a study looking at boys who were in 6th grade with absent fathers, their academic achievement did not increase just because they had a male teacher's influence. So as we want to say, it's so important to have male teachers in our schools. However, they cannot be our solution to this problem of absent fatherhood.
And piggybacking off of that thought, that point, it's really important to recognize that while a student may or may not react to a teacher's gender, it's really important for a teacher to be aware of his or her maybe implicit bias. Because research shows us that if a teacher is dealing with students who are of a different gender, they are much more likely to see that kind of report issues with that student. Caitlin, could you go to the next slide, please? So to kind of put some numbers behind this, research indicates that the odds that a student was perceived as inattentive or disruptive are respectively at least 19 and 30% higher when the teachers of the opposite gender. And a similar pattern was found with homework completion. Teachers are about 15% more likely to report that a student rarely completes homework when the student's gender is different than the teacher's. So again, these numbers just kind of communicate to us teachers that it's really, really important you proactively work to kind of disassemble any bias you may have and treat all students equally regardless of their genders.
So when we're thinking about implicit biases that teachers can have, we have those biases not just about our students, but also about their families and especially about their parents. So a lot of us, especially us second-year teachers, we probably had families that we kind of considered hard to reach or hard to connect with just because they didn't reply to things. And some of those families are the single parent families that we've been talking about. But we need to recognize that single parents can be just as involved with their children at home as parents in traditional families, which would be with 2 parents at home. And that recognizing that bias can lead to educational practices that support home involvement and result in positive effects on children's academic progress. So moving into the next part of our presentation, we want to talk about how we can facilitate parent involvement for the parent that is at home, whether that is 2 parents or 1 parent. So this is a model from Dr. Joyce Epstein at Johns Hopkins. She talks about 6 types of parental involvement. You can read those there on the slide, but I want to highlight one in particular, and that is communicating. So we all know that communicating with parents is really important. But what we need to recognize is that communication cannot just be one way. So it can't just be from teacher to parent. It has to be 2 ways. So what we're going to talk about next is just ways that you can actually facilitate that 2-way frequent communication. So teachers have to take concrete actions to support parent involvement. So there are more traditional things that you can do, which includes having just a positive rapport with the family, sending positive notes home about their student, at the beginning of the year, setting expectations and also informing parents of consequences. And then, of course, frequent communication, both on the academic side and behavioral side. And then many of us are already doing this, but parent-teacher conferences are super important, especially getting translators for those families that you may not speak the same language as. But then, of course, there are non-traditional ways to get parents involved as well. So when you assign homework, you can assign things that require students to share and discuss interesting tasks with their family. We can also invite parents as guest speakers for things that they are knowledgeable about. And we can finally ask how we can support parents in finding childcare for their students, rides to and from maybe after-school activities or parent involvement programs at your school. And finally, at the bottom of this slide, I just wanted to say that we need to look for opportunities to support parent involvement in the same way that we look for opportunities to interact with our students both in and outside of school. Now, naturally, it's not just what you do that affects parent involvement. As we keep returning to this fact, we have implicit biases. We have attitudes, knowledge, and skills that regard parent involvement that might be functioning as barriers. So looking at your beliefs and perceptions, there's two main areas I want to address here. So the first is your teacher efficacies. This is your belief in your own teaching effectiveness. And that predicts your facilitation of 5 types of parent involvement. So if you think that you're not going to do a good job, you probably aren't going to do a good job. So we need to foster teacher efficacy. We also need to notice that sometimes there's an issue with a mismatch of communication styles. So as a teacher, I know I preferred sending a group email home to all the parents of my homeroom students to ask for volunteers or maybe a field trip chaperone. However, parents, as you might imagine, they prefer individual invitations to become involved. So you might take a look and think about changing that in your own practice.
All right, thank you so much, Sophia. So right now we're going to move into our last strategy to kind of mitigate this gap that is created when there are non-resident fathers or fathers are uninvolved. Another way to do this is looking at culturally relevant pedagogy. So both Sophia and Michael mentioned things about implicit bias. We have implicit bias about genders, as well as about race, as well as about parent involvement. So culturally relevant pedagogy helps us to kind of look at those biases, hopefully disassemble them, and then respond to our students as they need us. This is especially relevant when our students don't have fathers at home, because we need to make sure that they're feeling as positively about their own self-identity in school as we can. This includes listening to our students, immersing ourselves in their culture, and validating their identities. This can apply to all content levels as well as all developmental levels. Black male teachers have been looked at specifically in one study that was done in 2016. They looked at one Black male teacher. He was a middle school teacher that taught science and math. And his students, when asked how they felt engaged in his class, what they liked about his class, they didn't necessarily mention that he was male or that he was Black. They did mention that he listened to them. He played music that they liked. He really immersed himself in the school culture. He knew all the basketball stats and what was going on, who they were playing that day. And then he actually took that immersion and put it into his classroom material, into the content. He included a lot of problems about video games and about those basketball games. So the students felt that he was really listening to them and then putting that into their content. And really making sure that the students feel that engagement and feel that they're being listened to is going to mitigate some kind of resistance that they have from that non-absent fatherhood. This is a model that kind of looks at the different parts of culturally responsive teaching. So notice that it includes family involvement. So it means that you are also reaching out, like Sophia mentioned, to include parents and things and make sure that you're understanding their families and putting that community context into your teaching as well. So making sure that you're being sensitive to students as they navigate their family and home lives. So lastly, we have some takeaways for you from our presentation today. So as we mentioned with the ecological model, home and school connection is very important for students. Increasingly, students are going home to single mother households, and that non-resident fatherhood can impact students in different ways. Maybe the fathers are involved, they just don't live at home, and that can be really beneficial if they are involved. But if they are not involved, that can be really negatively impact students. So as teachers, we can try to mitigate those negative effects by sending students to school counselors, by increasing parent involvement with that parent that is there. And lastly, making sure that we are attentive to culturally responsive pedagogy and using those strategies within our classroom. Thank you so much for listening today, and we hope that you learned something that you can take away from this. Thank you.